The suitcase was small, blue, with a broken zipper that never quite closed all the way, and it sat beside a 9-year-old named Theo on the wooden porch steps of his grandfather's house like it already knew something the boy didn't. The morning was warm, the kind of golden late summer morning that smells like cut grass and distant rain, and Theo sat with his knees pulled up to his chest, watching his parents' car idle in the gravel driveway. His mother Diane leaned out of the passenger window and blew him a kiss that didn't quite land anywhere real. "We'll be back before you know it, sweetheart," she said, her voice bright and a little too rehearsed, like she'd practiced the sentence in the mirror that morning. "Just a few days. Grandpa's going to spoil you rotten." His father, Marcus, didn't even roll down his window. He tapped 2 fingers against the steering wheel, glanced at his watch, and said something to Diane that made her laugh, a laugh that had nothing to do with Theo at all. Then the car pulled out of the driveway, tires crunching over gravel, and disappeared around the bend where the old oak trees leaned over the road like they were bowing to something. Theo watched until the sound of the engine faded completely, until there was nothing left but birdsong and the creak of the porch swing behind him. And then he sat there a while longer, because some part of him, even at 9 years old, understood that he had just watched something end, even if he didn't yet have words for what. Grandpa Walt found him there an hour later, still sitting, still watching the empty road, the little blue suitcase untouched beside him. He didn't say anything about it. He simply sat down next to the boy, the old porch step groaning under his weight, and looked out at the same empty road for a long, quiet moment. "You hungry?" he finally asked. Theo shook his head. "Well, I am," Grandpa said, standing up and holding out a weathered hand. "Come keep an old man company while he makes a sandwich he doesn't need." That was the beginning of it, though neither of them knew it yet. A few days became a week became a month. Diane called twice during that first month, breezy phone calls that lasted 4 minutes and ended with promises that dissolved the moment she hung up. By the time the leaves started turning orange and falling from the oak trees, Grandpa Walt sat Theo down at the kitchen table, poured him a glass of milk he didn't ask for, and said in the plain, unhurried way he said everything, "Looks like it's just you and me for a while, kid. That all right with you?" Theo, who had cried himself quiet in the first 2 weeks and then simply stopped expecting the phone to ring with good news, nodded. It was more than all right. It was the first time since the car disappeared around the bend that he felt something steady beneath him. Grandpa Walt never once said a harsh word about Theo's parents in front of him. Not when the months turned into a year and the calls grew fewer and further between. Not when Christmas came and went without so much as a card. Not even years later, when Theo was old enough to ask the hard questions and search Grandpa's face for the true answers hiding behind his careful, gentle non-answers. Walt would simply say, "Your mother and father are figuring some things out. That's not your job to carry. Your job is to grow up strong and kind and let the rest sort itself out." It was a strange kind of mercy, the way he refused to poison the boy's heart even when he had every right to. Legal guardianship came quietly, filed and processed without ceremony. A stack of papers signed at a lawyer's office in the county seat that smelled like old carpet and coffee. Walt never made it feel like a burden. He rearranged the small back bedroom that had once been his late wife's sewing room into a proper boy's room, hung curtains with little airplanes on them that he'd found on sale at the hardware store, and built a bookshelf with his own 2 hands out of reclaimed barnwood, sanding it smooth over 3 evenings until Theo's fingers could run across it without a single splinter. The house itself was modest. A 2-story farmhouse on the edge of a small town called Millbrook, with a wraparound porch, a leaning red barn out back that Walt used more for storage than any animals, and a garden that stretched behind the house in neat sun-drenched rows. Walt had been a carpenter and a handyman most of his life, the kind of man everyone in town called when a pipe burst or a porch step gave way, and though he never made much money doing it, he made enough, and he made it honestly, which mattered to him more than the number in his bank account ever could. He taught Theo everything, not in grand lessons, but in the small, accumulated moments of daily life. He taught him how to change the oil in the old pickup truck, how to coax a stubborn lawnmower back to life, how to plant tomatoes so they'd survive the first frost, how to budget the grocery money so it lasted the whole week, how to say thank you and mean it, how to shake a man's hand and look him in the eye. He taught him, without ever using the word, what it meant to have integrity, the quiet kind that doesn't need an audience. "Anybody can be good when people are watching," Walt told him once, the 2 of them fixing a neighbor's fence on a Saturday afternoon for no pay at all, beyond a plate of the neighbor's wife's cooking. "The real test is what you do when nobody's keeping score." Theo absorbed these lessons the way dry earth absorbs rain, thirsty for something steady after the unpredictable weather of his early childhood. In school, he became the kind of student teachers remembered fondly for years afterward. Not because he was effortlessly brilliant, but because he worked with a stubborn, quiet determination that outpaced kids with twice his natural talent. He'd stay after class asking questions until he understood, spend Saturday mornings at the kitchen table with Walt, quizzing him on vocabulary words, and slowly, methodically, build the kind of academic record that would eventually open doors neither of them could have predicted on that first lonely morning on the porch. Meanwhile, life for Theo's parents moved in an entirely different direction, one built on glossier surfaces and shakier foundations. Marcus took a job with a company 2 states away that promised him a title and a salary that made him feel, for the first time in his life, important. Diane, delighted by the fresh start, threw herself into the role of reinventing their lives completely, decorating a new house with furniture that looked expensive and often was, hosting dinner parties for Marcus's colleagues, slowly constructing a version of themselves that had no room in it for a son they'd left behind on a porch in Millbrook. They had another child, a daughter named Bree, 3 years after leaving Theo with Walt, and the arrival of this new baby seemed to complete something for them, filling whatever gap Theo's absence had left with a fresh, unburdened start. They told themselves, and eventually each other, comfortable stories about why things had turned out the way they did. Marcus's career had demanded so much of them in those early years. Diane hadn't been ready, emotionally, to raise 2 children while helping Marcus build his career. Walt had offered, hadn't he? He'd seemed happy to help. Surely Theo was better off, more stable, more settled than he would have been dragged along through their turbulent early years of reinvention. These were the stories they told themselves at dinner parties when someone asked delicately about their son who never seemed to be around. These were the stories that let them sleep at night, sipping wine on a back patio 2 states away, while a boy who shared their blood learned to ride a bike with his grandfather jogging alongside him down a gravel driveway, learned to tie a proper knot, learned to bake bread from a recipe scrawled in his late grandmother's careful handwriting, learned slowly and thoroughly an entire childhood that had nothing to do with them at all. Birthdays passed with a card, sometimes arriving a week or 2 late, signed with a hurried scrawl, and no real message beyond, "Happy birthday, love Mom and Dad." Christmases came and went with a package that usually contained something a little too young or a little too generic, a toy meant for a boy 3 years younger than Theo actually was, a shirt in the wrong size, gifts that revealed, more than anything else, how little his parents actually knew about who he was becoming. By the time Theo turned 12, he had stopped waiting by the window for cars that never came. By 13, he'd stopped flinching when classmates asked about his parents, and he had to explain again that he lived with his grandfather. By 14, when a well-meaning teacher asked him to write an essay about his family for a school project, he wrote 3 full pages about Walt and never once mentioned Marcus or Diane. And when the teacher gently asked him about it after class, he simply said, "This is my family. This is who raised me," with a certainty that startled the teacher more than any tears could have. Those years were not without hardship, of course. Walt's small handyman business meant tight months, especially in winter when work slowed and the heating bill climbed. There were nights when Walt ate a smaller dinner than Theo without ever mentioning it, nights when he told Theo he wasn't very hungry, so the boy could have a second helping. Neither of them could really afford to give up. Theo didn't discover this particular sacrifice until years later, when a neighbor mentioned it in passing, remembering how Walt used to come by on cold evenings asking to borrow a cup of flour or a few eggs, not because he'd run short unexpectedly, but because he'd stretched the budget, so Theo's lunch money and school supplies always came first. There was the matter of college, too. The ambition Theo had nurtured since he was old enough to understand what it meant, fed by teachers who saw his potential, and a grandfather who never once suggested his dreams should be smaller because of their circumstances. When Theo was accepted into a respected state university with a partial scholarship, the gap between what the scholarship covered and what tuition actually cost was a number that would have crushed most families in their position. Walt never let Theo see him worry about it. He simply, quietly, began selling things. The old pocket watch that had belonged to his own father went first, sold to a collector 2 towns over for a fraction of what it was worth, though Walt negotiated hard enough that the collector later told people it was the toughest deal he'd made all year. Then went the good set of woodworking tools Walt had collected over 3 decades, tools he'd used to build half the furniture in the house, sold to a younger carpenter starting his own business who never knew the full story behind the bargain price. Walt picked up extra jobs too, working weekends on projects that left his back aching and his hands raw, telling Theo only that he liked staying busy. It wasn't until Theo's second year of college, home for winter break, and rummaging through the barn looking for an old toolbox, that he discovered the truth. He found a small ledger, tucked into a coffee can on a high shelf, filled with Walt's careful handwriting tracking every dollar earned from side jobs, every item sold, every extra shift taken, all of it meticulously allocated toward T's tuition in a column that spanned nearly 2 years. Theo sat on an overturned crate in that dusty barn for a long time, the ledger open on his knees, understanding for the first time the true scope of what his grandfather had quietly carried without ever once making Theo feel the weight of it. He confronted Walt gently that evening, the ledger on the kitchen table between them, and Walt, uncharacteristically flustered at being caught, simply shrugged and said, "A man does what he has to for his family. Nothing more to say about it." But Theo saw, in the brief flicker of his grandfather's expression, just how much it had cost him, not just financially, but in the quiet exhaustion of a man well past the age when he should have been resting, still working himself thin so a boy who wasn't legally his own could chase a future worth having. It was around this time, nearly 20 years after that first morning on the porch, that Theo's parents reappeared. The first contact came in the form of an email from Diane, warm and casual in tone, mentioning she'd heard through a family friend that Theo was doing well in college and expressing how proud she was, how she'd always known he had it in him. There was no acknowledgement of the years of silence, no mention of missed birthdays or the childhood spent almost entirely without them. It was as though she'd simply picked up a conversation that had never actually been interrupted. Theo, now 21 and studying business administration with a focus that would eventually lead him toward finance, read the email 3 times before showing it to Walt. His grandfather read it slowly, adjusting his glasses, and handed it back without much comment beyond, "Well, that's your decision to make, not mine. I won't tell you how to feel about your own mother." Theo responded eventually, cautiously, and the correspondence grew from there, though it remained stiff and careful on his end, warm and eager on Diane's, as though she were trying to make up for 2 decades of absence through the sheer enthusiasm of her emails. Marcus joined the conversation a few months later, less effusive than Diane, but making his own overtures, mentioning a business trip that might bring him near Millbrook, wondering if Theo might want to grab dinner. They met, finally, at a restaurant in the county seat, a slightly awkward dinner where Marcus talked at length about his career, and Diane asked a stream of surface-level questions about Theo's studies, his hobbies, whether he had a girlfriend, questions that felt more like a stranger's polite curiosity than a parent's genuine knowledge of their child. Bree, now a teenager, came along too, quiet and a little wide-eyed, clearly having been told very little about the true story behind this half-brother she was meeting for what may as well have been the first time. Throughout the dinner, Theo watched his parents with a strange, detached clarity, the way you might watch actors in a play you already know the ending to. When Diane said, toward the end of the meal, "We always cared about you, you know. We just felt like Grandpa could give you a more stable environment than we could back then," Theo simply nodded, not because he agreed, but because arguing seemed pointless. When Marcus added, like, "We had no choice, really, with the move and everything," Theo noted quietly, the way his father's eyes didn't quite meet his when he said it. Their real motive for reconnecting remained frustratingly unclear to Theo for a long while, hovering somewhere between genuine, belated guilt and something else, something he couldn't quite name but felt instinctively, a kind of positioning, as though his parents were quietly reassessing whether the son they'd left behind might, after all, be worth reclaiming a relationship with. Now that word had reached them of his academic success and the modest but respectable trajectory his life was taking. Theo kept these interactions cordial, but guarded over the following years, careful never to let his parents further into his life than surface pleasantries required, while his relationship with Walt remained the true center of gravity around which everything else orbited. He graduated with honors, took an entry-level position at a regional financial firm, 2 hours from Millbrook, close enough that he made the drive back most weekends, close enough that Sunday dinners with Walt became a sacred, unbreakable ritual. It was during one of these ordinary Sunday visits, nearly 3 years after Theo's graduation, that Walt first mentioned the cough that wouldn't go away. "Probably just getting old," Walt said, waving off Theo's concern with the same stubborn practicality he brought to everything. But the cough persisted through the following weeks, and when Theo insisted on driving him to the doctor, the visit that was supposed to be routine turned into a series of tests, then a specialist referral, then a diagnosis that landed in the small exam room like a stone dropped into still water. Lung cancer, advanced enough that the oncologist's carefully measured words made clear this wasn't a fight they were likely to win, only one they might, with treatment, be able to slow down for a while. Walt received the news with the same steady composure he'd carried through every hardship Theo had ever witnessed him face. He asked practical questions about treatment options, about timelines, about what to expect, and when the doctor left the room, he turned to Theo, who was sitting rigid in the plastic chair beside him, visibly fighting back tears, and said gently, "Well, guess we'd better make the most of the time we've got then." He refused any treatment that would rob him of his remaining good months in exchange for a longer stretch of sickness and confinement, choosing instead a path focused on comfort and quality over quantity, a decision Theo fought against initially with every argument he could muster, until Walt took his hand one evening on the porch, the same porch where a 9-year-old boy had once waited with a small blue suitcase and said, "I've had a good life, Theo, a hard one in places, but a good one. Mostly because of the years I got to spend with you. I don't want to spend what's left of it fighting a battle the doctors already told me I can't win. I want to spend it living. With you, however much time that turns out to be." And so they did. Theo took a leave of absence from work, moved back into his childhood bedroom with the airplane curtains still hanging slightly faded in the window, and spent that final year in a kind of bittersweet abundance, savoring ordinary moments with a new, aching awareness of how finite they'd become. They fixed up the old barn together one last time, Walt directing from a folding chair when his strength gave out, Theo doing the physical labor while his grandfather supervised with the same patient precision he'd always brought to teaching. They cooked Sunday dinners from Grandma's old recipes, Walt narrating the memories behind each dish, filling in gaps of family history Theo had never known to ask about. They sat on the porch most evenings, watching the same gravel driveway where a car had once disappeared around a bend of old oak trees, though now the silence between them held nothing but peace. Word of Walt's illness eventually reached Diane and Marcus, and to Theo's mild surprise, they made an effort to visit more frequently during those final months, though the visits often felt more performative than genuine, filled with a kind of anxious cheerfulness that seemed designed to reassure themselves more than to comfort Walt. Bree, now older and more perceptive, seemed to sense the deeper currents running beneath these family gatherings, often lingering near Theo in quiet moments, asking careful questions about what her half-brother's childhood had actually been like. Questions that suggested she was beginning to understand a family history that had been carefully sanitized for her benefit. As the months wore on and Walt's strength diminished, the visits from Marcus and Diane took on a subtly different tone, one Theo noticed but chose not to comment on. Diane began asking gentle questions about the house, about whether Walt had gotten his affairs in order, about whether he had a will. Marcus made a point of mentioning more than once how much the old farmhouse property must be worth now, how the land values in Millbrook had really come up in recent years. Theo filed these comments away without response, watching his parents with the same detached clarity he'd carried since that first awkward dinner years earlier, understanding now with growing certainty exactly what had likely motivated their renewed interest in reconnecting. One evening, near the very end, with Walt confined mostly to the hospital bed the hospice nurses had set up in the downstairs living room, he called Theo close and asked him to sit beside him. His voice had grown thin by then, but his eyes remained sharp, clear, entirely present. "I need you to hear something, and I need you to really hear it," Walt said, taking Theo's hand in both of his own weathered ones. "A family isn't the people who share your blood, Theo. It's the people who stay. It's the people who show up on the ordinary days, not just the ones where something's expected of them. You understand what I'm telling you?" Theo nodded, unable to trust his own voice. "I need you to promise me something," Walt continued. "Whatever happens after I'm gone, whatever your mother and father do or say or want, I need you to promise me you'll live without bitterness. Not because they deserve your forgiveness, maybe they don't, but because bitterness is a weight you'll carry. And I've watched you carry enough weight in your life already. I want you to set it down. I want you to build a good life, a full one. And I don't want any part of that life poisoned by holding on to what they took from you. You hear me?" "I hear you, Grandpa," Theo managed, his voice breaking. "Good," Walt said, and something in his shoulders seemed to relax, as though he'd finally set down a weight of his own. "Good. That's all I needed." Walt passed away 11 days later, on a quiet Tuesday morning in early spring, with Theo holding his hand and the first light of dawn just beginning to filter through the window of the room where he'd lived nearly his entire life. The funeral was held at the small Millbrook Community Church, and the turnout surprised even Theo, who had known his grandfather was well-liked, but hadn't fully grasped the scope of it until he saw the pews filling with neighbors, former clients, old friends from decades past, all of them arriving with stories about some kindness Walt had shown them, some fence he'd fixed for free, some meal he'd brought over during a hard winter, some quiet piece of wisdom he'd offered at exactly the right moment. The church overflowed with the accumulated evidence of a life spent, deliberately and consistently, in service to other people, a kind of wealth that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the depth of a man's character. Marcus and Diane arrived dressed in appropriately somber black, positioning themselves near the front of the church with an air of grieving children that struck several of the older attendees as somewhat performative, given how rarely anyone in Millbrook had seen them over the preceding 2 decades. Bree, now 19, sat quietly beside them, her expression harder to read, though Theo noticed her watching the parade of townspeople sharing their memories of Walt, with an increasingly troubled expression, as though she were slowly recalibrating everything she'd been told about her family's history. At the reception following the burial, held in the church's modest fellowship hall over coffee and casseroles brought by half the town, Theo overheard, not for the first time, his parents' conversation drift toward practical matters far sooner than seemed decent. "We should really talk to the lawyer about the house," Diane murmured to Marcus near the coffee urn, apparently not realizing how close Theo was standing. "And whatever savings he had, it's only fair we're included given everything." "Given everything," Marcus repeated, an odd little smile touching his mouth. "Right. We'll set up a meeting with the estate lawyer this week." Theo said nothing, though something in his chest tightened at the casual entitlement in his parents' tone, the ease with which they discussed dividing up the modest fortune of a man whose final 2 decades they'd played almost no part in, whose sacrifices had built the very stability and success that made their renewed interest in the family worthwhile in the first place. The reading of the will took place a week later, in the cramped, slightly musty office of Harold Jennings, the same small-town lawyer who'd handled Walt's legal guardianship of Theo all those years ago, now well into his 70s himself, but still sharp as a tack. Marcus and Diane arrived early, dressed in a manner Theo privately noted looked more suited to a business meeting than a family gathering. And Bree came too, seated a little apart from her parents, her expression guarded. Harold cleared his throat, adjusted his reading glasses, and began. There were small personal bequests first. Walt's old truck to a neighbor who'd always admired it, his fishing gear to a nephew, a few counties over, a modest sum to the Millbrook Community Church that had hosted his funeral. Marcus and Diane sat through these preliminary items with visible impatience, exchanging glances that suggested they were waiting for the main event. "Now," Harold said, setting down one document and picking up another, this one sealed in an envelope that bore Walt's careful handwriting across the front. "Mr. Hargrove left specific instructions regarding the remainder of his estate, including this property, his savings accounts, and a life insurance policy he'd maintained for some years. Rather than detail these instructions myself, he asked that I read this letter aloud, in the presence of all parties named in his will." He opened the envelope, cleared his throat again, and began to read in Walt's own words, transcribed with the careful precision of a man who'd known exactly what he wanted to say, and had likely rewritten the letter more than once to get it right. "If you're hearing this," Harold read, "then I've gone on ahead, and I imagine most of you are sitting in Harold's office wondering how this is all going to shake out. I want to say a few things plainly, because plain speaking has always suited me better than dancing around the point. Marcus, Diane, you are my son and daughter-in-law, and I loved you both, in my own way, for a long time. But I watched, over 20 years, as you built a life that had no room in it for the boy you left on my porch, with a small blue suitcase and a promise you never kept. I never said anything about it while I was alive, because I didn't want Theo growing up in the middle of a war between the people who should have loved him. I let you make your choices, and I never interfered because I wanted my grandson to grow up without the poison of that conflict eating away at his childhood. That was my choice, and I don't regret it. But I want to be honest with you now, in the only way I have left available to me. Love isn't something you inherit simply because of the family you're born into. It has to be earned through years of showing up, through the ordinary sacrifices nobody sees or claps for, through choosing, again and again, to put someone else's needs ahead of your own comfort. Theo earned every bit of what I'm about to leave him, not through some legal claim of blood, but through 20 years of being the one who stayed, the one who showed up, the one who chose every single day to be part of a family that mattered. So here's my final instruction, and I ask that Harold see it carried out exactly as written. My house, my land, my savings, and the proceeds of my life insurance policy are to go, in their entirety, to my grandson, Theo. Marcus, Diane, I'm leaving you each a copy of an old family photograph, taken the summer before you left Theo with me, back when we were all still, in whatever imperfect way, a family. I want you to have it as a reminder, not of punishment, but of the choice you made and the years you can't get back. I hope sincerely that you find peace with the family you've built since, and I hope that somewhere in your hearts, you understand why I've made this decision. It isn't spite. It's simply the truth, laid plain. The estate I built goes to the one who helped me build the life it came from. The office fell into a heavy silence when Harold finished reading, the only sound the soft tick of an old clock on the wall. Marcus's face had gone through several shades of red during the reading, and Diane's mouth had opened and closed several times as though she meant to interrupt, but couldn't quite land on the right words. Bree, sitting a little apart, had tears welling in her eyes, though whether from grief, shame, or some complicated mixture of both, Theo couldn't quite tell. "This is," Marcus finally managed, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "this is absurd. He was not of sound mind. We're contesting this. This is, Theo, surely you understand this isn't right. This isn't how families are supposed to." "Marcus, Harold interjected calmly, clearly having anticipated exactly this reaction. "I should mention that Walter had this letter, along with the full will, reviewed and notarized by an independent attorney 18 months before his passing, specifically to preempt any question of his mental competency. He was, I can assure you, entirely of sound mind, and quite deliberate in every decision reflected in this document. You're welcome to pursue legal counsel if you'd like to contest it, but I'll tell you plainly, as I've told clients in similar situations before, you'll find very little ground to stand on." Diane, recovering some of her composure, turned to Theo with an expression that seemed to be reaching for wounded sincerity. "Theo, you have to understand, we never meant for things to turn out this way. We always thought we'd come back for you eventually, once things settled down. It just... time got away from us. We didn't know how to..." "You had 20 years, Theo said quietly, the first words he'd spoken since the reading began. It wasn't delivered with anger. Not really, just a kind of flat, tired clarity that seemed to land harder than any raised voice could have. 20 years to come back, to call, to send more than a late birthday card. Grandpa never once told me not to love you. He never poisoned me against you. I stopped waiting for you on my own because eventually a kid figures out the difference between people who are coming back and people who aren't." He stood, gathering the folder of documents Harold had prepared for him, and looked at his parents one last time before leaving the office. "I'm sorry Grandpa's gone. I know that probably sounds strange coming from me given everything, but I mean it. Whatever else this family has been, he made sure I never had to be sorry about my own childhood. That's more than I think either of you understand." The weeks following the will reading brought a slow, uncomfortable unraveling for Marcus and Diane as word spread through their social circles, largely through Bree, who found herself increasingly unwilling to keep participating in the sanitized version of the family story her parents had maintained for years. Old neighbors from Millbrook, contacted by curious relatives, confirmed details about Walt's years of quiet sacrifice, the extra jobs, the sold possessions, the meals skipped so a boy who wasn't even legally required of him could have everything he needed. These stories, once scattered and private, began to coalesce into a fuller picture that made Marcus and Diane's earlier excuses ring increasingly hollow among the people who'd once accepted them at face value. Marcus did, in fact, consult a lawyer about contesting the will, but the attorney, after reviewing the documentation Harold had prepared, advised him plainly that pursuing the matter would likely cost more in legal fees than any settlement they might realistically hope to win, and would almost certainly further damage what remained of the family's reputation, both in Millbrook and among their own social circle back home. Reluctantly, bitterly, Marcus let the matter drop, though the resentment simmered beneath the surface of every subsequent family interaction for years to come. Theo, meanwhile, found himself the unexpected steward of Walt's modest but meaningful estate, the farmhouse and its surrounding acreage, a savings account that reflected decades of careful frugality, and a life insurance policy that, combined with the property's value, amounted to a sum considerably larger than Theo had ever expected to inherit. He took a leave of absence from his finance job, initially meant to last only long enough to settle the estate, but as the weeks stretched on, he found himself increasingly reluctant to return to the 2-hour commute and cubicle life he'd built 2 hours away from everything that actually mattered to him. He made the decision eventually to leave his corporate position entirely and return to Millbrook full-time, moving back into the farmhouse where he'd grown up, determined to honor his grandfather's legacy, not just by preserving the physical house, but by continuing the spirit of quiet, practical service that had defined Walt's entire life. Over the following 2 years, Theo poured both his inheritance and his own considerable financial acumen into restoring the old property, repairing the barn properly this time, updating the aging farmhouse with the kind of thoughtful improvements Walt himself would have appreciated, without ever losing the character and history embedded in every worn floorboard and hand-built shelf. But he didn't stop at simple restoration. Drawing on both his grandfather's example and his own professional training, he established in the newly renovated barn a community workshop open to any young person in Millbrook who wanted to learn practical trade skills, carpentry, basic home repair, budgeting, and financial literacy, the same foundational lessons Walt had quietly taught him across 2 decades of ordinary days. He named it simply Walt's Workshop and funded it initially through a portion of the inheritance, though it quickly began attracting support from the broader community as word spread of what Theo was building. Local tradespeople volunteered their time teaching evening classes. A modest scholarship fund, established in Walt's name through the local community foundation, began offering small grants to Millbrook students pursuing trade certifications or college degrees, funded partly by Theo's own contributions and partly by donations from townspeople who remembered Walt's quiet generosity and wanted to see it continue in some tangible form. The workshop and scholarship fund grew steadily over the following years, becoming something of a fixture in Millbrook's community life, a living monument to a man who'd never sought recognition for anything he'd done, but who had, in the end, left behind a legacy that reached far beyond the walls of his own modest farmhouse. Theo found, in building and running this endeavor, a sense of purpose that had eluded him during his years in corporate finance, a way of honoring his grandfather's memory that felt infinitely more meaningful than any inheritance check ever could have. Bree reached out to Theo directly about a year after the will reading, requesting to meet without her parents present, and Theo, remembering his grandfather's final instruction about living without bitterness, agreed. They met at a small diner in the county seat, and Bree, now in her early 20s and studying social work at a university several states away, spoke with a candor that surprised Theo, admitting how little she'd actually understood about the true circumstances of his childhood until the will reading had forced a fuller accounting into the open. "I grew up hearing this vague story about how you'd been raised by Grandpa because of some complicated family circumstances," she told him, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands. "I didn't know it meant they just left you for 20 years. I didn't know any of the rest of it either, the sacrifices Grandpa made, all of it. I feel sick about how little I understood and how easily I just accepted the version of the story that made our family look okay." Theo listened, and though he felt no particular anger toward Bree, who had, after all, been a child herself throughout most of this history, he also felt no need to reassure her more than the truth allowed. "You didn't do anything wrong," he told her honestly. You were a kid too, but I appreciate you wanting to understand the real story now. That matters." Their relationship grew slowly from there, not into anything resembling the closeness Theo shared with Walt's memory, but into something honest and in its own careful way, real, built on actual understanding rather than the fiction their parents had long maintained. Bree began visiting Millbrook occasionally, volunteering at Walt's workshop during her school breaks, getting to know, in small pieces, the community and history that had shaped her half-brother's entire life without her knowledge. Marcus and Diane's attempts at reconciliation with Theo proceeded far more haltingly, marked by long stretches of silence, punctuated by occasional, often clumsy overtures. Diane sent a card on Theo's birthday each year, and he responded eventually with brief but civil replies, neither warm nor hostile, simply present in the measured way Walt had modeled for him throughout his childhood. Marcus, for his part, seemed to struggle more visibly with the aftermath of the will reading, his pride wounded in ways that manifested as long periods of avoidance, followed by occasional attempts to reconnect that often felt, to Theo, more like attempts to salvage his own self-image than genuine efforts at repairing what had been broken. It was nearly 4 years after Walt's passing, and Theo's 28th birthday approaching, when Marcus finally made a visit to Millbrook alone, without Diane, arriving unannounced at the farmhouse on a quiet Sunday afternoon while Theo was working in the garden his grandfather had once tended with such careful attention. Theo straightened up from the tomato plants, wiping dirt from his hands, and regarded his father with the same careful, watchful neutrality that had become his default posture in these interactions over the years. Marcus looked older than Theo remembered, the confident sheen of his corporate success somewhat dulled, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the easy authority Theo remembered from childhood. "I've been wanting to say something for a long time," Marcus began, standing awkwardly near the garden fence, "and I haven't found the right way to say it. So I'm just going to say it plainly, the way your grandfather always did." He paused, seeming to gather himself. "I'm sorry, Theo, for all of it. For leaving you that day and telling myself it was temporary, for letting temporary become permanent, for the birthdays and the phone calls I should have made and didn't. I told myself so many stories over the years about why it was okay, why you were better off, why the timing was never right for us to make things right. But none of those stories were true. The truth is, I chose my own comfort, my own new life over showing up for my son, and I let that choice calcify into 2 decades of silence because facing what I'd done felt harder than continuing not to face it." Theo listened without interrupting, watching his father's face carefully, weighing the words against the years of accumulated evidence about who his father actually was. "I'm not asking you to forget any of it," Marcus continued. "I'm not even sure I'm asking for forgiveness exactly, because I'm not sure I've earned the right to ask for that. I just needed you to hear me say it plainly. Finally, without excuses attached. You deserve better than what your mother and I gave you. Your grandfather gave you what we should have, and he did it better than we ever would have managed anyway, but that doesn't erase what we owed you and didn't pay." Theo was quiet for a long moment, the late afternoon sun slanting warm across the garden, the same light that had fallen across this same patch of earth for nearly 20 years of ordinary Sundays with Walt. "I appreciate you saying that," he finally said. "I mean that. It's more honesty than I think I ever expected to hear from you." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "I don't hold on to anger toward you. Not really, not anymore. Grandpa made me promise, near the end, that I'd live without bitterness, and I've tried to honor that. But I also can't pretend the last 20 years didn't happen, or build some sudden closeness with you that isn't actually there. If you want a relationship, a real one, built slowly, on actual honesty instead of the stories we used to tell each other, I'm open to that. But it has to be built the same way Grandpa built everything with me. Through showing up. Consistently, not through one conversation in a garden." Marcus nodded slowly, something in his posture suggesting both relief and a clear-eyed understanding of exactly how much work lay ahead of him if he truly meant to rebuild anything worth having. "That's fair," he said quietly. "More than fair." They didn't hug, didn't manufacture some cinematic reconciliation neither of them had actually earned yet. But Marcus stayed for dinner that evening, the first meal father and son had shared alone together in longer than either of them cared to count, and it was, in its quiet, imperfect way, a beginning, though Theo made no promises about where exactly it might lead. Diane's path toward any similar reckoning proved slower and more halting, colored by a pride that took considerably longer to crack, though small gestures accumulated over the following years. A longer phone call here, a visit to Millbrook there, gradual attempts at actual presence that Theo met with the same measured openness he extended to Marcus, neither rushing toward reconciliation nor closing the door on it entirely. The years that followed brought a kind of quiet, hard-won equilibrium to Theo's life. Walt's workshop grew into a genuine community institution, its scholarship fund helping dozens of Millbrook students pursue education and trade certifications they might not otherwise have afforded. Theo married, eventually, a local schoolteacher named Ellie, who had grown up in a neighboring town and who understood, without needing lengthy explanation, exactly what the old farmhouse and its history meant to him. They raised their own children in that same house, the same wraparound porch, the same garden rows Walt had once tended, filling the rooms with a new generation's laughter that somehow always seemed to carry an echo of the man whose quiet love had made all of it possible. On a warm evening many years after that first lonely morning, with a small blue suitcase, Theo sat on the porch steps of his grandfather's house, watching his own two children chase fireflies across the yard as the sun set behind the old oak trees at the bend in the driveway. Ellie sat beside him, her hand resting easily in his, and somewhere down the road, a car's headlights swept briefly across the trees before continuing past, not stopping, not turning into the driveway, just another car on just another evening. Nothing like the one that had once disappeared around that same bend, carrying away everything a 9-year-old boy had thought he understood about family. He thought in that quiet moment of his grandfather's words, spoken so plainly in those final weeks, "People will remember what you leave in their hearts long after they forget what you leave in your will." Walt had left him a house, a piece of land, a modest fortune built through decades of quiet sacrifice, and Theo had used all of it to build something that would outlast any single inheritance. A workshop that taught kids practical skills and self-respect, a scholarship that opened doors for students who might otherwise have found them closed, a home filled with the same steady, unglamorous love that had once saved a boy nobody else had bothered to stay for. His children's laughter carried across the yard, bright and unburdened, growing up in a home built on the same foundation of honesty and quiet devotion that had once rescued their father from abandonment. And Theo understood, watching them, that this was the truest inheritance his grandfather had ever given him. Not the house, not the money, not even the workshop that bore his name, but the simple, hard-won understanding that family isn't a matter of blood or obligation, but of choice, renewed every single ordinary day by the people who choose, again and again, to stay. That autumn, Walt's workshop held its 10th annual open house, an event that had grown from a handful of curious neighbors wandering through a newly renovated barn to a genuine community gathering that drew people from 3 counties over. Theo stood near the front doors greeting arrivals, watching a steady stream of families walk through, some of them former students of the woodworking classes now grown into skilled tradespeople themselves, some of them scholarship recipients returning to share how far their education had carried them, and some of them simply neighbors who remembered Walt from the old days and wanted to see what had grown from the seed of his quiet generosity. Ellie moved among the crowd with easy warmth, directing volunteers, checking on the younger children who'd been given small sanding projects to keep their hands busy while their parents toured the exhibits. And Theo found himself, more than once that afternoon, simply standing still and watching the whole scene unfold, struck by how thoroughly a single man's unassuming decency had rippled outward across 2 decades and touched more lives than Walt himself could ever have imagined when he first sat down beside a grieving 9-year-old on a porch step and offered him a sandwich neither of them particularly wanted. Bree arrived midway through the afternoon, now a licensed social worker herself, having built a career specifically focused on family reunification services and child welfare advocacy, a path she'd later admit to Theo had been shaped in no small part by everything she'd learned about her own family's history in the years since the will reading. She brought with her a young intern from her agency, a college student named Priya, who was shadowing her for the semester, and Theo watched the two of them tour the workshop with genuine professional interest, asking thoughtful questions about how the scholarship fund selection process worked, how the mentorship pairings were structured, whether the model might translate to other small towns facing similar gaps in support for young people without stable family resources. "You should write this up somewhere," Bree told Theo later that evening, as the crowd thinned and volunteers began breaking down tables. "Not for the recognition, I know that's not why you do it, but other towns could use something like this, and there's no reason the idea has to stay contained to Millbrook." Theo considered the suggestion for a long moment, watching Ellie chase their youngest daughter around the emptying barn while their older son helped an elderly volunteer stack folding chairs with careful, serious concentration. "Maybe someday," he said. "Grandpa never did anything for the credit. I think if I ever write it down, it'll be for the same reason he did any of it. Because it's useful, not because it needs a name attached." Marcus attended that year's open house too, a small but significant shift from the early years of his slow reconciliation with Theo, when he'd mostly kept his distance from Millbrook events out of what Theo suspected was a lingering discomfort with how visibly the whole town remembered exactly what he'd once walked away from. He'd grown into a quieter, more careful version of himself over the years, the corporate confidence gradually replaced by something more measured, and he spent a good portion of the afternoon simply observing, occasionally helping carry supplies, mostly staying out of the spotlight in a way that suggested he understood, finally, that his presence here was a privilege extended to him rather than a right he could take for granted. Diane's progress remained slower still, though she had, in recent years, begun sending more than perfunctory birthday cards, calling occasionally just to talk rather than to manage some logistical matter, asking real questions about her grandchildren that suggested genuine curiosity rather than obligatory interest. She hadn't yet made the drive to Millbrook herself, something Theo noticed but didn't press, understanding that whatever reckoning she still owed herself about the choices of those early years was hers to work through in her own time, at her own pace, just as Walt had once given both of them the space to find their own way without forcing the process. As the last of the visitors filtered out of the workshop that evening, and the autumn light faded into the particular blue dusk that Theo had always associated most strongly with this land, this porch, this whole stretch of gravel driveway curving away toward the old oak trees, he found himself standing alone for a few minutes near the barn's entrance, looking back at the farmhouse glowing warm and gold against the darkening sky. He thought, as he often did in these quiet moments, of that first morning, the small blue suitcase with its broken zipper, the sound of a car pulling away down the gravel drive, the particular hollow ache of watching something end without yet understanding what would take its place. He thought of Walt's steady hand extended toward him on that porch step, the plain and unhurried invitation to come inside and share a sandwich neither of them needed, but both of them, in some quiet way, required. He thought of the ledger hidden in a coffee can, the sold pocket watch, the extra shifts worked long past the age when rest should have been earned, the whole accumulated weight of sacrifices made without ever once being announced or expected to be repaid. And he thought of the letter, read aloud in a small, musty lawyer's office, the plain, unadorned truth of a dying man's final instruction, not born of spite or score settling, but of a simple, hard-earned clarity about what actually constitutes a family, what actually deserves to be called an inheritance. Love isn't something you're owed by blood. It has to be earned through years of showing up, through the countless unremarkable days when nobody's watching and nobody's keeping score. Theo had spent the years since trying, in his own way, to make good on that inheritance, not by hoarding what he'd been given, but by extending it outward, teaching the next generation of Millbrook kids the same practical skills and quiet self-respect his grandfather had once taught him, opening doors for students who might otherwise have found them closed, building a home filled with the same steady devotion that had rescued him from abandonment all those years ago. He walked back toward the house as the last light faded from the sky, his children's voices calling out to him from the porch, Ellie's silhouette framed warm and familiar in the kitchen window. And he understood, with the same plain clarity his grandfather had always carried, that whatever else this family's story had been, whatever wounds it still carried, whatever slow and uncertain reconciliations remained unfinished, this house, this porch, this land had become exactly what Walt had always meant for it to be. Not a monument to what had been lost, but a living testament to what could still be built, one ordinary, faithful day at a time, by the people who chose, again and again, to stay.